The Emerald Knight, Chapter 2. Bruana Morgana Noctiface Firefist was a princess. She, like most infant girls, was reminded of this fact several times a day by any number of people, and as such had no concept that it was different from other words repeated as identifiers for her, such as baby, or brew brew, or Anna, or precious. She didn't have any of the responsibilities yet associated with royalty, especially associated with being the eldest child in a royal family. She mostly spent her days in the playroom, with her nurse, or in the garden of the palace. Very rarely was she invited to important political discourse, and when she was, she found them boring and made the fact known, saying so loudly and repeatedly until someone would remove her from the unpleasant event. Unfortunately, she was in the stage of life where she communicated mostly through incoherent shrieking and throwing whatever object she could get her hands on. Fortunately, this was limited in a very real sense to what she could physically touch. She had, so far, exhibited none of the magical ability that one would expect to see from the child of Orinda Noctiface Firefist, the most powerful mage in Zren. Bruana's favorite person in all of existence was her father. He was, in her opinion, the best person one could imagine, and she was fairly certain that she had wished him into existence at the exact moment she had gained sentience. He was lying on the grass, and she was in his lap, and they were staring up at the clouds drifting slowly past in the bright spring sky. "That one looks like a bunny," he said, and she agreed by chewing on her fingers. "When I was younger," he told her, I used to hunt rabbits in a field by my house. I didn't always live in the palace." Bruana agreed with this as well. She very often agreed with her father. The only thing that she could ever remember disagreeing about was whether or not she should be allowed to drink from the bottles that he frequently carried around. And she knew that eventually he would change his mind in favor of her opinion, as he had on every other opinion she could ever remember having. She tilted her head so that her view changed, puffy clouds replaced with just the smallest amount of his upturned chin. "Dada!" she said, quite forcefully, and he sat up and looked down at her. "Yes?" he asked, his tone expressing none of the patronizing edge that people often use with children, his eyes sparkling. She tried very hard to explain to him that she would like to roll in the grass, but when she tried to articulate that thought, he seemed confused, eyebrows knitted, pushing a small wrinkle in his forehead, and lips pressed into a thin line. She tried again, and added hand gestures, and he sat up straight and crossed his legs, holding her gently before setting her on the ground on the back of her expensive silk dress. "You understand me more than anyone, princess," he said with great sincerity, and she agreed with that as well. "Dada!" she agreed, and ripped up a clump of grass and offered it to him. He took it eagerly, and she watched his expert hands transfixed as he smoothed it out and braided it into long strips. He plucked a puffy yellow flower and wove that into it as she tore more and more grass for him. Eventually she had given him enough, and he had somehow transformed it into a headband, which he sat gently on her head. "That's a flower crown," he said. "You're princess of the garden." Bruana had not previously known that princesses were of anything, but she agreed by taking the crown off of her head and eagerly chewing on it. She liked to chew on things. "Clyn," a voice asked, and he turned to see his wife in her pristine robes adorned with religious paraphernalia. She had been to the shrine and looked even stronger than usual. She was beautiful. She had been beautiful the day they met, covered in dust and open wounds, the day she saved him. "You look beautiful," he said, because it was the only thought in his head. "You look drunk," she said with disgust, and picked up her child. "The baby is eating grass." I used to eat grass, it's fine, he agreed, in confusion. Clyn, sober up, she demanded. We haven't cleaned up Xander's entire mess yet. We still have a lot of enemies. You have an army to lead. Later, he said, looking up at her. Later, when Verana's older. Not now. Come here, sit with me. Clyn, she said, and her voice was dangerous. Get up. He did, and he stumbled, put out his arms, and steadied himself on thin air. Hey, he asked, does that cloud look like a rabbit to you? Arinda looked up, and a small smile appeared on her cross face. God, it's beautiful here. He cupped her face and kissed her. Verona toyed at the necklace her mother was wearing and felt a shock of electricity run through her body. She didn't tell anyone, as it sometimes happened and didn't seem at all important. She stuck it in her mouth with the crown. By Theseus, Clyn, you taste like alcohol. What happened? Nothing. You know better than to do nothing. Your mind attacks you when you do nothing. Do something. I couldn't. It was the middle of the night, and it crept up on me. I don't want to wake you. He ran his fingers through her hair, letting the sensation move from his fingertips to his brain. You can't keep doing this. You can't keep blaming yourself. You're a hero. You're a hero. You overthrew a tyrant. You overthrew a tyrant. Clyn, I swear to God. She was growing impatient. I'm sorry I killed your father, he said, with no provocation, and there were tears in his eyes, and it was not the first time. Why? She asked, genuinely confused. She always asked this, and he never answered. He went on not answering until she shook her head and heaved Verona onto her shoulder. Clyn, go to the shrine and pray. You'll feel better. Oh, God wants to hear from me, he explained. You can't understand it. You're fulfilling your destiny. I can't expect you to understand. You could expect it, she countered. You could do a lot of things. Go to the shrine and ask for guidance. I hate that fucking shrine! He shrieked, pulling his hands away and digging them into his own hair, ripping it out in frustration. Verona vehemently disagreed. She had been to the shrine and she loved it. It was the most peaceful, comforting place she had ever been. She wondered how such a wonderful person could be so wrong. Can you not? Arinda asked, motioning to the baby. I hate that place, he said without looking up. I hate it. You can't keep letting her control you from beyond the grave. Arinda was annoyed, but she was also concerned. The two emotions moved and mixed within her. They were not compatible, and the feeling was uncomfortable. She resented him for it. After a few seconds, the resentment gave way to pity, and she said, No one blames you. Everyone blames me! He looked up, and his eyes were glowing a bright green, which would not have concerned her had his eyes been green. But as his eyes were normally blue, she bit at her lower lip, and her mind wondered what that thing was doing to him. Clyn, calm down. She spoke in her most soothing voice. You're acting crazy. Please, just stop. Take a deep breath. If you were a mage... I'm not a mage! He said, and it sounded as if he thought she were insulting him. If you were, you would have learned to control these outbursts. It isn't your fault that you were never trained. You have to calm down before it takes you again. She reached out with one hand and cradled the side of his face. You aren't in danger. You aren't a danger. My love, my hero, my poor, broken boy. Clyn stopped pulling his hair out long enough to gently wrap a hand around her wrist. Dada? Verona said, though it was garbled, around the necklace and crown. He heard the concern, and his heart broke. She was worried about him. She was worried about him. Did she think that she had to save him? I'm fine, princess. He smiled at her. Daddy's fine. Daddy loves you. She agreed with this as well. She was beginning to develop a warped and somewhat incorrect idea of what the word fine meant. And in the future, if this was reinforced, she would be completely unable to differentiate which situations and states of mind were fine and which were not. Clyn did not know enough about the mind of a child to know that he was causing that kind of damage. He didn't know that it would be better to say, Daddy will be fine later, but he's a little upset right now, or even, I'm sorry that Daddy scared you. He thought that he was helping. Very often in his life, he thought that he was helping when objectively he was doing irrevocable damage. He would never do anything to hurt her if he had known enough to know what actions to take. You're not fine, Arinja corrected him. But I love you. I need you to sober up. You and I and Morgan and Anila all need to talk in the war room. We have a big mess to clean up. Please do something so that you could be coherent this evening. I'm sorry, he said, and he hadn't let go of her hand. Oh, God, I'm so sorry. Please go to the shrine, she asked, and he finally met her eyes. I'll try, he promised, but Theseus doesn't listen to me. Of course he does, she smiled softly. You're the chosen one. Clyn laughed and cried and kissed her palm. She pulled him close and kissed him again. Bruana chewed through the flower crown and tasted the bitter flavor of the grass.